It was the middle of December, the kind of night where the cold seeps into your bones no matter how warm the car is. I had just left a friend's house after a late dinner, and the back roads were my only option to get home. It had been snowing for hours, and the highway was already shut down. I figured the back roads would be empty, maybe even peaceful. But that night, I learned that isolation doesn't always mean safety. The clock on my dashboard read 11:42 p.m. as I turned onto the old unlit stretch of road. The only sounds were the faint hum of the engine and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers fighting the accumulating snow. Beyond the reach of my headlights, everything was pitch black. About 20 minutes into the drive, I saw him. He was standing on the side of the road just beyond the bend, illuminated in the narrow beam of my headlights. A man, tall and thin, wearing a long black coat. He didn't move as I approached, just stood there, head bowed slightly, his arms hanging limply at his sides. I slowed the car, unsure of what to do. It was late, the temperature was well below freezing, and he didn't look like he was prepared for the weather. My first instinct was to drive past, but as I got closer, I noticed something that stopped me. His face. It was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they didn't reflect the light the way they should have. They looked empty, like he was staring through me rather than at me. I rolled the window down just a crack, letting the icy wind whip into the car. "Do you need a ride?" I called out. The man didn't respond at first, he just stood there unmoving. Then after what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly and stepped toward the car. I hesitated but unlocked the passenger door. He climbed in, bringing with him a wave of cold air and the faint scent of damp earth. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice low and monotone. I nodded, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. "Where are you headed?" I asked, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. "Just keep driving," he said. Something about his tone sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't a request, it was an order. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles whitening, and drove on. Minutes passed in silence. He didn't say anything, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. The only sound was the faint crunch of snow under the tires. I kept stealing glances at him. His face was still as pale as before, his hands clasped in his lap. I noticed something else too. His coat wasn't wet. Even though he'd been standing in the snowstorm, not a single drop of melted snow clung to him. "Slow down," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "It's just up ahead." I frowned. "What's up ahead?" He didn't answer. He just stared out the windshield, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. I followed his line of sight but saw nothing, just more road disappearing into the dark. Then I saw it, a house barely visible through the swirling snow. Its windows were dark, its roof heavy with snow, and it looked abandoned. I'd driven this road dozens of times before and had never seen a house here. "Stop," he said. I did as he asked, pulling the car to a halt just in front of the house. He opened the door and stepped out, pausing for a moment before turning back to look at me. "Thanks for the ride," and he said, his tone flat. And then he was gone, walking toward the house without looking back. I sat there for a moment, my heart pounding. Something about this didn't feel right. I glanced at the passenger seat where he'd been sitting. It was completely dry, as though he'd never been there at all. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned to look in the rearview mirror. There he was, sitting in the back seat, staring at me with those same hollow eyes. I didn't think, I just slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, skidding on the icy road. But I didn't care. I needed to get away. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and jumped out of the car, my hands trembling. The clerk looked at me like I was crazy as I rambled about what had happened. "Are you sure you were on that road?" he asked after I finished. "Of course I'm sure," I snapped. He shook his head. "Nobody's lived out there for years. That house burned down decades ago." I didn't sleep that night. Driving late at night has always had a strange appeal to me. There's something serene about empty roads and quiet landscapes, especially when the world is blanketed in darkness. But one particular drive last winter changed my perspective forever. I had just left my best friend's house after a late-night game marathon. The drive home was a 2-hour journey on mostly deserted highways that cut through miles of barren fields and forests. The kind of drive where your headlights are the only source of light for miles and you feel completely isolated. It started out uneventful. The crisp night air outside made me crank up the heat in my old sedan. The dashboard lights glowed dimly and the radio was tuned to a low volume, playing one of those late-night stations with soft rock and an occasional commercial break. I was cruising down a stretch of the highway, my headlights illuminating the white lines, when I noticed something odd in the rearview mirror. It was a pair of headlights, faint and distant. Nothing unusual at first, just another car sharing the road with me. But after about 10 minutes, I noticed they hadn't gained or lost any distance. They stayed at the same exact spot behind me, as if pacing me. I brushed it off. Probably just another tired driver on their way home. I turned my attention back to the road ahead and let my mind wander. But as time passed, the unease began to settle in. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, those headlights were still there, unwavering, never closer, never further. About 30 minutes into my drive, I reached a bend in the highway. The road curved around a dense patch of forest. I knew this stretch well. It was one of the few areas where the highway dipped into shadow, with tall trees arching over the road like a tunnel. I glanced in the mirror one last time as I approached the curve. Those headlights, had they gotten closer? As I rounded the bend, something bizarre happened. The headlights behind me vanished, not faded into the distance, not turned off, just completely disappeared. I slowed down slightly, peering into the rear-view mirror. Nothing, just an empty road stretching into darkness. I let out a nervous laugh. Maybe they had turned onto a side road, or maybe their headlights just weren't visible from this angle. Still, I felt an odd chill creep over me. I told myself to focus on the road ahead. 10 minutes passed. The unease began to subside until I rounded another curve and my stomach dropped. The headlights were back. The same ones, now closer, much closer than before. This time they didn't stay at a consistent distance. They began to gain on me, fast. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my heart racing. Whoever was behind me wasn't just driving, they were speeding. I debated pulling over to let them pass, but something about the situation felt wrong. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator, my car protesting as it climbed past the speed limit. The headlights behind me matched my speed. The highway stretched on, barren and silent. I was miles from the nearest exit or gas station. Panic began to set in. What did they want? Why were they following me? I honked the horn and flashed my brights at them, hoping they'd get the message to back off. No response. The headlights stayed glued to my bumper, unrelenting. Finally, up ahead, I saw a sign for a rest stop. The relief was almost overwhelming. It wasn't much. A couple of vending machines, a dimly lit parking lot. But it was something. I veered into the rest stop's entrance, hoping the other car would continue down the highway. But they didn't. They followed me into the parking lot, pulling up to a stop a few spaces away. I could barely breathe as I watched their headlights shut off. I couldn't make out the driver in the darkness. I considered bolting out of there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped out of the car, heart pounding, and turned to face the other vehicle. It was an old, beat-up truck, its paint chipped and rusted. The driver's door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy jacket and a beanie. He stood there for a moment, staring at me without a word. Then he smiled. "Sorry if I scared you," he said, his voice gruff but calm. "Your back tire looked wobbly. I was trying to flag you down to let you know." Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. I glanced at my tires. They all looked fine, perfectly inflated. When I looked back at the man, he was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, somewhere between amusement and malice. I muttered, inching back toward my car. "I'll check it out later." He didn't move, just stood there watching me. My instincts screamed again. "Get out of there!" I climbed back into my car and locked the doors, not bothering to waste time. As I reversed out of the lot, the man remained rooted in place, his eerie smile never wavering. I sped back onto the highway, my hands shaking. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see those headlights again. But they never came. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. The man's face lingered in my mind. That unsettling smile etched into my memory. The next morning, I checked my tires. They were fine, just as I had thought. To this day, I don't know what he wanted. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, or maybe he had something far worse in mind. All I know is, I'll never stop at another rest stop alone at night again.